All right, let me catch us back up to where we are. So after Paul's arrival in Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey, he was in the temple to complete the ritual purification process that was part of the plan that James and the elders had formulated to demonstrate to the Jewish Christians that Paul did not forbid Jews from voluntarily observing aspects of the Mosaic law. You remember they had this plan. He's going to purify himself and he's going to pay for the purification for the Nazarites. Well, when he's in the temple doing that, some Jews from Asia who were in the temple, they spotted him, and then they stirred up the crowd and they seized him. And the Roman commander, the tribune, Claudius Lysias, he took control of the volatile scene that resulted in he permitted Paul to address this mob that had been trying to kill him. And when Paul told the mob, when he said that the Lord had sent him to the Gentiles, well, that was when they completely lost their minds. They're throwing dust in the air and taking their cloaks off. And then the commander, he prepared to have Paul flogged to get to the bottom of what's going on. He doesn't quite understand what all this commotion is and this emotion and this anger. So he prepares to have Paul flogged to get the answers to that. But he learned that was a mistake. Not only because Paul was a Roman citizen, but he also finds out that Paul was a citizen by birth, which meant that Paul had a higher social status than Lysias' citizenship by purchase. So he's really in a bad situation there. But he's still determined to get to the bottom of what is going on with these accusations against Paul by the Jews. So he calls together the chief priests and the council, the Sanhedrin, and he has Paul brought to the meeting. And Paul declares in there that he's innocent, saying in essence that these charges that are being brought against him are lies. And that's when the high priest Ananias orders that Paul be struck in the mouth. And Paul then rebuked him very sharply for his unlawful conduct. And then some of the Jews there, they rebuke Paul for daring to insult the high priest. And Paul says, you didn't know that the one giving the command to strike him was the high priest. And as I pointed out last week, there's some difference in how to understand that. Was Paul, when he says he didn't know that he was the high priest, was his denial sarcasm? Like saying, I didn't know that anybody who would dare act like this and flout the law in front of the whole Sanhedrin, that guy's the high priest. Was it sarcastic, as many believe, or was it a statement of fact, which it may have been? Okay, that's where we left off, and let's pick back up there. Now, recognizing that this assembly that has been called together by Lysias, Paul recognizes that this assembly had included Sadducees and Pharisees. So Paul declares himself to be a second-generation Pharisee. He's the son of a Pharisee. That's his Jewish identity. That's the sect, the Jewish sect, in which Paul was raised and in which he received his theological training. And he then declares that he's on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. You see, and what he means by that, he means that the hostility toward him and his message of Jesus' resurrection it's ultimately driven by theological opposition to the resurrection of the dead. You see, now Pharisees, they believed in, like most Jews, they believed in and they accepted the truth of an end-time resurrection. So the Pharisees had far less distance to travel in accepting that end-time resurrection had already begun in the resurrection of Jesus. They had a much less distance to travel than did the Sadducees, who rejected in principle the very notion of resurrection. The Sadducees denied there was any resurrection. The Pharisees accepted the reality, like most Jews, of an end-time resurrection, so they had less distance to travel in accepting that end-time resurrection had already begun in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And by focusing on the Sadducees' objection to the resurrection, you see, as the root of their opposition to the gospel, Paul winds up dividing this assembly along sect lines, along the lines of Pharisees and Sadducees. So instead of allying with the Sadducees in their opposition to Paul, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees think Paul is wrong. Jesus isn't the Messiah. You see, but rather than allying with the Sadducees in opposition to Paul, the Pharisees, at least in this hearing, they allied with Paul in their opposition to the Sadducees. See, so the Pharisees accept the reality of an end-time resurrection. The Sadducees deny it. So Paul says it's all about the resurrection, so he succeeds in dividing them along sect lines and in explaining why the assembly divided over the resurrection. Luke says in verse 8, he says, "For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection." They say there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Now, the Sadducees' rejection of a belief in resurrection, that's clear historically. That's one of the few things that we know about the Sadducees. But this clause that Luke puts in there where he says, nor angel, nor spirit, that's very puzzling. That's very puzzling. I mean, on its face, it seems that Luke is saying that the Sadducees deny the existence of angels and spirits. But there's no other evidence anywhere that the Sadducees denied the existence of angels or spirits. And more importantly, it runs headlong into the fact that the Sadducees accepted the testimony of Scripture, especially the Torah, the Pentateuch. The first 5 books, they accepted that as authoritative, and those 5 books refer to angels. So he's saying, well, how can Luke be saying they deny the existence of angels when they accept as authoritative the Torah, and the Torah refers to angels? John Meyer, in his book Marginal Jew, he says, "Yet there is grave difficulty with understanding Luke's assertion in this natural sense. The Sadducees certainly revered the Torah as normative, and the Torah speaks in various passages either of the angel of the Lord, a sort of visible representation or spokesman of Yahweh, or of a group of angels, obviously subservient to Yahweh. For example, Jacob's dream of the angels of God ascending and descending on a ladder, reaching up to heaven in Genesis 28:12, or of individual kinds of angels with individual tasks, for example, the cherubim, who guard the way to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3:24. So you have here this issue that in this, if you take Luke that way, then there seems to be an issue. And of course, skeptics seize on that. Skeptics and those who have a low view of inspiration. And they say, well, Luke just made a mistake. Like the Spirit of God writing through Luke, he's just wrong. Okay, that's the buzzer for me. That's not an answer. He's not wrong, you see. You don't have to, it's certainly possible. You could say, well, is Luke saying they deny the very existence of? Maybe they're not saying. Maybe Luke's not saying that. You don't have to think that. He says they say there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits. Maybe he doesn't mean they deny the existence of these things. He may, for example, be saying that the Sadducees say there is no revealing angel or spirit. There is no interacting angel or spirit, meaning they don't believe that angels any longer intervene in human history as messengers of revelation. Maybe that's what they think. Not that they don't exist, because the Torah says they exist, but maybe they now have this idea that yes, they exist, but they no longer intervene interactively as a source of revelation. Maybe that's it. Now, that Luke intends such a qualification that he's dealing with them no longer speaking or interacting, it's possibly suggested by, it's at least consistent with the next verse where the Pharisees defend Paul by saying a spirit or angel may have spoken to him. You see, he may have spoken to him. And of course, from the Pharisees' perspective, they disagree with Paul, but they're saying to the Sadducees, maybe a spirit or angel did in fact reveal something and speak to him, which from the Pharisees' perspective, they're thinking that Paul mistook as a resurrection. You see, because they disagree with Paul, but they're saying to the Pharisees, they're being split over this issue, and they're saying, wait a minute. What if an angel or a spirit did speak to Paul, and that's why Paul got off track? And see, so it seems like this idea of an angel revealing something or speaking may be what he's talking about. Now, if he's saying that, you see, so like when he says here, what if an angel or if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, they're clearly challenging a Sadducean claim that such a thing couldn't happen, right? And so wait a minute, what if that did happen? What if that did? So they're challenging that claim. Now you could say, yeah, they're challenging that claim because the Sadducees, according to Luke, don't believe they exist. So how could they be speaking? All right, that's possible. But it's not necessary. Okay, so he may be saying, listen, that the Sadducees, when they don't accept angels or spirits, that there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, it may be that he's speaking of something like that they don't reveal themselves any longer. Now you say, well, do we have any evidence that the Sadducees held such a belief? That the Sadducees believe that angels or spirits no longer interacted and revealed things? Well, no, we don't. But that's not as significant as it seems because we in fact know very little about the Sadducees' belief. We have no writings, none, in which the Sadducees express their own beliefs. We have no writings from Sadducees where they express their own beliefs, and the New Testament tells us very little about the Sadducees' beliefs. The only sources we have are Josephus and the rabbinic writings, and they're limited and they're biased against the Sadducees. Here's what John Meyer says. He says, as for Sadducean beliefs and practices, we are poorly informed. It's well to remember that as with the Pharisees, so with the Sadducees, we're dealing with a group that existed for over 200 years in a Palestinian society that was undergoing massive changes around the turn of the era. No doubt both the Pharisees and Sadducees developed and mutated along with the society in which they were embedded. Yet all we have are flat, static descriptions of their beliefs and practices with no historical sense of their developments and mutations. So he's saying, look, we have to be careful about what we think we can know of the Sadducees' belief, if they are evolving along with social. So it may be that this was a belief that they had, that we simply don't have a record of. That wouldn't be crazy to think that in light of the changes that are going on. And this theological dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees, this dispute becomes so heated that Paul has triggered. It becomes so heated that it got violent. And since the dispute really relates to Paul's culpability regarding his teaching, right? Both the Pharisees and Sadducees agree that Paul is wrong. That's their idea. Jesus is not the Messiah. So what the dispute that Paul has triggered, it's whether Paul's error, whether that error can be mitigated by appeal to the appearance of an angel or a spirit. So the Pharisees are saying, well, what if an angel or spirit did appear to him? Right? That got him off on the wrong track. And these guys are saying that can't happen. And so because Paul is the center of this, the dispute is about Paul and whether or not he can mitigate his culpability for his error by appeal to angels or spirits. He's the locus of the debate. So when he talks about, his body going to be torn apart, that's what he's talking about. Paul's body becomes the battleground. And the commander's afraid that he'd be torn to pieces. So he has Paul forcibly removed from their midst and has him brought into the barracks. Now, this is hot stuff. There's a lot of anger going on. And then that night, the Lord appeared to Paul and reassured him. It says in 23:11, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Here's what Richard Longnecker says about that. Paul had feared such a reception at Jerusalem. You see these texts in Acts and in Romans 15:31. And now his worst fears were being realized. He had planned to go to Rome and minister throughout the western part of the empire after his visit to Jerusalem. You see that in Romans 15. But developments at Jerusalem were building up to a point where it appeared his life could come to an end through any number of circumstances beyond his control. Undoubtedly, he was despondent as he awaited the next turn of events in his cell at the fortress of Antonia. On the following night, however, the risen and exalted Jesus appeared to Paul as he had done at other critical moments in his ministry and encouraged him by his presence. The Lord said, "Take courage." He assured Paul that he would yet testify in Rome as he had done in Jerusalem, certainly as F.F. Bruce has observed. This assurance meant much to Paul during the delays and anxieties of the next 2 years and goes far to account for the calm and dignified bearing which seemed to mark him out as master of events rather than their victim. And you see how helpful this would be, right? Because Paul, this uncertainty and all these things, when he says, "You must testify at Rome." Okay. So when he's sitting in these languishing for years in a jail cell, don't you know how strengthening that promise and that statement would be to him? Because I could see myself just simply losing my mind. Sitting here in this thing. Now, the next day, so he tells him in 23:11, "You must testify at Rome." Okay? The very next day, when it was day, more than 40 Jewish fanatics. So you're going to testify at Rome, and the very next day, what happens? Here comes the plot that's going to what? Take him to Rome. You must testify at Rome. The next day, we have more than 40 Jewish fanatics. They hatch a plot to kill Paul. And these people are serious about it. They hatch a plot to kill Paul, and they commit by oath to fast until they had accomplished that task. We're going to fast until we kill Paul. Okay, so that kind of puts a time limit on it. We better get about this, but we're going to fast till we kill him. And the plan which they divulged their plan to the chief priest and the elders. The chief priests and the elders, they tell them that. And that plan was that the chief priest and the elders, in concert with the council, in concert with the Sanhedrin, they would request Lysias, the commander, to have Paul transferred from the fortress there, to have him come before them to come to another hearing. You see, summon Paul for another hearing, ostensibly to have a fuller airing of his case. It's a ruse. Go to him and say, we really need to kind of sharpen a couple of points, that we missed in the deposition. We need to have him interviewed again, so bring Paul down here so we can clarify some matter. Who knows? Maybe the whole thing will go away. If we can get a clearer picture of what's going on. And so this is a ruse that they're working, and their plan was they're going to kill Paul as he's being transported in Jerusalem from the fortress to the place where they're setting the hearing. And this, of course, confirms Paul's assessment of the high priest, doesn't it? His assessment of him as a hypocrite and a whitewashed wall. Yeah, that was right. Now, Paul's nephew, the son of his sister, he learns of the plot. We're not told how he learns of the plot. But he learns of the plot. And he goes and he tells Paul. And Paul then has a centurion. He has a centurion escort his nephew to the commander and tell the commander what's afoot. Tell him what's going on. Fill him in about this plot that's happening. And the commander listened to the nephew. He listens to him. And then for security reasons, the commander tells him not to tell anybody that he had told the commander about the plot. Because you've got this plot here now. They're doing their thing. I'm going to thwart what they're doing. If they learn that I now know what they're doing, well, then they may adjust. So keep quiet about it. Don't let anybody know, because that's my tactical advantage, that they don't know that I know about the plot. And so we learned that the request, by the way, it's going to be made. They were going to make this request the next day, and as Marshall says, the plotters didn't want to fast for too long. Right? They've taken an oath to fast, and they're saying, we're going to get this done. And so they're going to make this request the next day. But knowing, you see, that as readers, we know that the Lord has plans for Paul to testify in Rome. Right? So as readers, we're prepared for this plot to be foiled. We just don't know how. But we're prepared for that. Now the commander, Lysias, he orders 2 centurions to assemble a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. There being some debate about how to render the spearman word there. But 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to head out for Caesarea that night at 9 o'clock at night. They're heading out, escorting Paul. They're instructed to provide mounts for Paul and to bring Paul safely to the Roman governor Felix, who, as Roman governors do, resides in Caesarea. They come to Jerusalem during festivals and things to keep an eye on the Jewish mob. But the center of Roman administration of Palestine is in Caesarea. And so he's transporting Paul to the Roman governor Felix in Caesarea. Now this Claudius or Antonius Felix, he was governor of Judea from 52 to 59. And his wife, Drusilla, she was Jewish. You see that in Acts 24:24. Now, Brian Rapsky, he says of Felix, Felix pacified the countryside by capturing bandit leaders and sending them on to Rome, crucifying their followers and punishing their supporters. Felix also put down less militant movements by slaughter. About the year 54, he dealt with a popular movement led by a self-proclaimed prophet from Egypt. Many were killed and a good number taken prisoner, excepting the Egyptian who escaped. This action renewed banditry in the countryside. Several years later, the Apostle Paul was mistaken for the Egyptian. You remember, we just looked at that. And that's who this was. He's saying, aren't you the Egyptian who caused the revolt? That's not Paul. Paul says, no, I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia. But this is the guy we're talking about, and it gives you a sense not only of how ruthless these guys were, but also of the tension that existed there in that society at the time. Because critics, they claim that, look, they say, Lysias, this is crazy. Lysias would have never sent such a large force to escort a single prisoner. Luke, what's Luke know? He'd have never done that. No Roman, he wouldn't have done that. But as Ben Witherington says, in view of the tenseness of the times, with various people of high social status being assassinated by the Sicarii, it is not impossible that Claudius Lysias might commit this size of a force for a short mission such as this if he felt Paul's safe conduct to Caesarea was very important and the situation very dangerous. And you think about, look, here's this, Lysias is looking here and he's saying, I'm in this great time of turmoil. Not long ago we had a revolt. It'll be less than 10 years we'll have the Jewish revolt of 66. That is the Jewish war against Rome that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. So this is a tense situation. A few years ago we had to arrest and kill a bunch of people. You've got these people who are out killing the elites or the leaders. And what am I looking at? I'm seeing here, I don't really understand the circumstance, but I'm seeing a great deal of people highly emotional, highly angry about this one dude. And so you could see, what if this is something going on I don't understand? I cannot afford to have something happen that triggers something massive. So it's not at all silly. And I love what Witherington says after this. He says, it's a good rule to be skeptical about modern scholars who think they know more about what a Roman commander might do in handling a crisis than Luke did. That's what I like. He's sitting here, never do that. Luke doesn't know a thing. I'm thinking, Luke's writing right here. Luke knows Paul. What's Luke know? Well, what do you know? You're looking back 2,000 years and putting pieces together and trying to tell me they'd never do that. I'm thinking, well, I can think of reasons why they do it. Whether you like it or not. You're just bent on trying to say Luke's wrong. And Luke's not wrong. But he says, so this is it. Now, Lysias, he sent a letter. He sends a letter that explained to Felix, the Roman governor. So Lysias is a tribune. He's a commander who has the responsibility for Jerusalem. He's there, and he sends a letter to the Roman governor of Judea, the big guy. He sends a letter to him explaining what was happening. And this is required when you're transferring a prisoner. You can't just say, hey, here's this guy. Well, who's this? I don't know. I was told to bring him here. No. So he writes a letter explaining what's going on, why he's doing it. And of course, Lysias, I love this. He spins the explanation in his favor, claiming that he initially rescued Paul because he had learned that Paul was a Roman citizen. Now, isn't that perfect? Isn't that perfect when somebody is writing to his superior that he says, well, let me tell you what happened. I had learned that Paul was a Roman citizen, so I came to his rescue. When you and I know that what actually happened was he learned Paul was a Roman citizen as he was about to flog Paul. But that's just perfect. That's how that would play. Yeah, let me tell you, I'm kind of the hero in this thing. I learned he was a Roman citizen. I rescued him, and I got to the bottom of some things, can't figure out some other things, so I'm sending him up to you. So he reports that he puts that out, and he reports based on Paul's appearance before this council that Lysias had assembled of the high priest and the Sanhedrin, that the accusations against him had involved questions of Jewish theology. That's what he could get out of it. This is a Jewish theological debate rather than any criminal offense that was subject to a Roman court. So he passes that on to to Felix. And he explains that the urgency is because a plot had developed against Paul, so he's sending him to avoid that, and it would be followers. He was going to order Paul's accusers to go to Caesarea to present before Felix, the Roman governor, their beef with Paul. Why they think he has violated Roman law that justifies his death. And then the soldiers march through the night. They leave at 9. They march through the night to Antipatris, which is a military station about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And you here's Jerusalem here. You go here to Antipatris, and then they're ultimately heading to Caesarea. But some of the guys are going to turn back after they get to here. Because, see, the real danger, the volatile time politically, where these guys can hide out guerrilla warfare tactics, is in the hill country. You see, so here, they've got to escort him through all of this very dangerous hill country, and then when they get to the plain here, things are a lot easier. So anyway, they take him through there at night. Now, how long such a march would have taken to go from Jerusalem with this many people? We've got the 200 soldiers, the 70 horsemen, and the 200 spearmen. How long it would take a group of that size to make that trek, that's debated. But even if they didn't arrive in Antipatris until after dawn, it would still be true that Paul had been brought there by night. He had been brought there through the night. And then sometime during the next day, meaning after the sunrise, following the day where they had transported Paul, the foot soldiers and the spearmen, they head back, leaving only the 70 horsemen. And the reason they head back is their military might is no longer thought necessary because they've gotten through the hill country, which is the danger zone. You see, they're now in the plain where they can see, and that you can't hide and ambush me like that. And so you have the horsemen that are left there, and they complete the journey to Caesarea. They continue on, and they could, of course, with the horsemen, they could travel much faster because you don't have to have the foot soldiers and the spearmen. So the horsemen continue on to Caesarea, and they deliver him there. When they'd come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor. So their job, they have done what they've been tasked to do. And then Felix, the Roman governor, he inquires about Paul's home province. This has some kind of judicial significance on who has jurisdiction, who can do what. He inquires about his home province, and despite the fact that Paul was from the region of Cilicia, right? He's from Tarsus. Despite the fact he's from Cilicia, Felix announces that he will deal with his case when his accusers arrive. So he agrees to take the case, and it seems that he legally, from people who know these things, it seems that he could legally have punted to the officials in charge of Cilicia if he wanted to. In other words, if he was eager to dodge this and ship him off, it seems like he could have done that. But for various political reasons, he chose not to avail himself of that option, and he ordered Paul to be guarded in the palace that had been built. Well, he says Herod's Praetorium. That was the palace that had been built by Herod the Great, and that was now the headquarters of the Roman administration. Herod the Great builds this palace. They then use it in Caesarea to administer the province or the region of Judea. And so that's where they are. And then after 5 days, the high priest Ananias and some of the elders and their professional advocate, a lawyer, somebody who speaks on their behalf, a man named Tertullus. They arrive in Caesarea, and they're there to make the case against Paul. Right? Lysias has shipped him up there, saying these people are here claiming all this stuff, that they got charges against Paul. All I see in this hearing is simply Jewish theological matters, but I've told them to go up there and present their case. So they arrive, they're there with Felix, and after you get some standard complimenting, this is just typical ancient rhetoric. Sometimes, "O king, live forever," whatever it is. We know that you're great and you're doing all this good stuff. That's just intro. And so after some standard complimenting, the case that Tertullian's a later Christian writer. This is Tertullus. The case that Tertullus, he presents, it boils down to, Felix going, all right, what do you got? You're here telling me he's violating Roman law, he deserves to die. Now, here, give me, what do you got? In his case, it boils down to, Paul stirs up riots among the Jews throughout the world. And you can see Felix on, wait a minute now, you grabbed him in Jerusalem, right? I want to know about that. Why do he, all around the world, we've heard he stirs up riots. Well, what about, why did you get him? What are you telling me that he did that deserves death here? He says, look, he stirs up riots. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. And he tried to profane the temple before the Jews seized him to prevent that. So that's what it boils down to. That's the case that he makes. And Tertullus tells Felix, rather than presenting evidence, rather than demonstrating these things are true, he tells Felix, he says, look, you can confirm the truth of the charges by examining Paul yourself. Well, that's something. That's some prosecutor. I got nothing, but you go ahead and ask the defendant and he'll tell you. And so that's what he winds up doing. And the Jews who are with Tertullus, Tertullus is representing them, bringing the case on their behalf. They agree, they join in, they say, yeah, what he's saying is true. Yeah. Now, just as a footnote, verse 7 almost certainly is not original. You see like in the ESV, it's left blank. Most modern English translations, they don't render it, they don't translate it, they either omit it, they bracket it, or they relegate it to a footnote, and that's because it's not original. But that's just a side note. Now, Felix nods to Paul to speak, and after complimenting Felix, which is, of course, again, you know, this is how it works. This is the way you would speak to someone. He compliments Felix, and then he declared that his accusers, he says, listen, they didn't find me disputing with anybody. Go ahead and examine him. You can find out what I'm saying is true. All right, Paul, is that true? No. It's flat out not. It's nonsense. They didn't find me disputing with anybody or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple, in the synagogues, in the city. They did not find me doing any of that. And that's why they have to resort to these vague and unsubstantiated rumors about my conduct in distant lands that they've just heard somewhere. Oh, yeah, Paul, he stirs up trouble all over the world and all this stuff. That's why they got to resort to that, because they have no indication, no evidence that I did what they're claiming that I did here. None of that's relevant to why I was arrested in the temple. It's all just nonsense. They can't prove that I incited any disturbance or that I attempted to profane the temple. They can't prove that in any way, shape, or form. As we might put it, Paul is saying, they got nothing. They got nothing. They're up here talking, dragging me here, all of this hubbub. And when push comes to shove, when you ask him, they got nothing. That's what Paul winds up saying to them. Now, it's true, Paul adds, with no apology. It's true that he worships the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob according to the way, according to the Christian faith, what they call the sect of the Nazarenes. But that's in keeping, worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in accordance with the Christian faith, in accordance with the way, that's in keeping with everything that's laid down in the Scriptures. It's not contrary to it. It's in keeping with everything laid down. And he does so having a conventional Jewish hope, a standard conventional Jewish hope in God, that there will be a resurrection of all the dead on Judgment Day, which hope his accusers, at least the Pharisees, also accept, and they're not subjected to persecution. So he says this is standard. They agree. There's a hope in the resurrection of the dead. In other words, the question of resurrection is at the heart of the Christian faith. And it's a theological issue. Within Judaism, it is not a matter for Roman courts. And we continue to observe this distinction today in law. That courts will not inject, they do more and more. But this idea that there is a doctrine of an ecclesiastical organization, that they have a right to do their own stuff, and you don't inject yourself into theological debates and as a civil court start deciding matters of theology. Well, that's what Paul is saying here. This is a theological debate within Judaism about resurrection. It has nothing to do with Roman law. Nothing to do with Roman courts. Now, of course, Paul, in doing this, in making his defense to Felix, he's preaching. Right? This is the opportunity. Yes, he's making his defense, but he's also in that preaching to Felix and anybody else who'll hear him. He wants them to know about the Christian faith and how it flows and how it's the fulfillment of all that has been written. Now, given that he believes in a resurrection of the just and unjust, that he believes completely that all people will stand before God for judgment, he takes pains to maintain a clear conscience before God. Right? He says, I believe this. So because I believe this, I'm not somebody who's likely going to lie to you. I'm telling you, I take pains to maintain a clear conscience. I live the truth of a belief in the end-time resurrection and the judgment of God. So I take pains to do what's right. So I'm not somebody who's going to do that. And then finally he explains that he had come to Jerusalem bringing alms for the poor, right? Remember, he'd been on this large gathering of this Gentile collection for the poor saints in Judea. So he says here that he comes to Jerusalem bringing alms for the poor, which is a recognized act of Jewish piety. And as it turns out, I come bringing alms, and as it turned out, to present offerings, referring most likely to the offerings of the 4 Nazarites that he enabled. You remember, that was part of the deal. Paul was going to enable those Nazarites to make their offerings. So he comes here, he says, bringing alms for the poor, and as it turns out, to present offerings. And that's what he was doing in the temple. I wasn't there profaning the temple. I wasn't doing anything wrong in the temple. I was doing what everybody would understand is right in the temple. That's why I was there. That's what I was doing. And having completed his own purification ritual, that's what he was seized in the temple. That's why he was there. That's what he was doing. He was creating no disturbance. And he then begins to explain that it was some Jews from Asia. It's from Jews from Asia who were behind this whole thing, but he breaks off to declare that they need to be here. He says the ringleader, what this was really precipitated by were these Jews in Asia. And then he breaks off and says, they ought to be here. Somebody wants to accuse me, let's bring these people in. The actual root of the charge, where are they? They're sending in these people who don't know what's going on, so nobody can get a hold of them. Bring them in front of this Roman court. They're the real accusers. And in their absence, he says, if you don't do that, in their absence, these Jews who are present, they should specify the wrongdoing they found me in. None of this vague junk. None of this stuff I hear that. None of this stuff about, well, I hear rumors that he's doing stuff. They should specify what crime they found me in when I stood before this council in Jerusalem. And all that they had there was nothing other than the issue that he identified in that hearing. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you this day. And that still stands. And his point is, it is a theological debate. It is not a Roman crime. And that's where we'll have to leave it. Thanks.